Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare from 2024. Now, I don't even know if I knew about this film before the other day. It may have come across my radar at some point, but to be perfectly honest, it is so kind of initially unremarkable looking in the current cinematic landscape that it wouldn't have necessarily turned my head if not for the fact that it is directed by Guy Ritchie. We've talked about Guy Ritchie on this show before, I think multiple times, but in particular, some time ago, I watched The Gentleman, which I actually rewatched last night because I was thinking about my reflections on that movie and how I had felt about it at the time. And going back to it and rewatching it again, I actually look upon it more fondly than I did at the time. I think I was a little critical, a little bit confused, and not entirely sure how I felt about it at the time. And while I don't disagree with any of the statements I made at the time about that movie, I've come to appreciate it a little bit more as a whole and as a transition for Ritchie away from his more small budget historic, or like his historically older, I don't know why I'm putting historical in there, his older films that are lower budget and a little bit more rough and tumble. I still really like those. I will still always miss those if he never makes anything quite like that again. But I have a better appreciation for The Gentleman. And so, funny enough, now he's naming wise, he comes and makes this movie called The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which I believe is actually named after the book that it's based on, but that's kind of neither here nor there. This movie, in its initial presentation, looks like another sort of vehicle for some large acting names, and is a return to some... Man, did I watch The Man from U.N.C.L.E. on this show or not? I can't remember now. I should have checked that before. It looks a little bit like that. He also directed that movie, and it reminds me a little bit of it in that sense of being a movie that is more about the typical Hollywood spectacle than about his particular stylings. It also, while it does have more than the typical amount of, more than the typical Hollywood amount of British actors and British setting in it, it feels very Hollywood in a lot of its designs. We'll get into that in a little bit. The overall premise is looking at the sort of the establishment of the special operations executive, sort of the precursor to the idea of modern special operations warfare and that kind of thing during World War II. And that in itself is a very interesting story that has a lot of, there's a lot of stories to be told, things that have been declassified over the years, lots from this era in particular, and lots of notable individuals and characters, really, who came out of that because they were in many ways sort of extraordinary. One of the characters in this movie is one of the characters in this movie is Ian Fleming, the person who worked in the Special Operations Executive and then subsequently went on to be the writer of James Bond. And one of the other characters is the real world person who Fleming allegedly based most of his characterization of Bond upon. I believe it's the main character of this movie is the real world person. But it gets blurry because this is also a heavily modified, not historically accurate, somewhat fictional account of real events that did happen, or a real operation, at least with real people in it. And so that all gets a little bit extra messy when considering Ritchie as a director and what is sort of his tendencies for his writing and directing, and is where I sort of wanted more from this film. Now, let me let me say ahead of it, this is not a bad film. I think it's quite entertaining. I think if you want to watch something that's a little bit less mentally intense and a little bit more goofy warfare, action movie kind of stuff, very Hollywoodized, then I think it's really pretty decent in that regard, at least in the things that have come up in the last few years. We've had sort of this back and forth between the dying off of the more accurate, gritty, dark, and depressing military movies versus the more goofy, more high-spirited, and hopeful, I would even say, military movies that are trying to paint a sort of more heroic picture of characters either in real historical events or fictionalized historical situations. And those have flip-flopped back and forth in cinema in the last 10 years. This is definitely leaning towards the latter, where, especially with casting setting somebody like Ritchie to direct, you're going to get a little bit more humor, a little bit more levity. And while it's still a very serious topic with some very serious and concerning characters in it, it is not trying to go for the dull and gritty, which would generally be my preference anyway. So if you're looking for something in that regard and you liked, if you like Ritchie's other work, and especially something like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which is a little bit of a lighter take on a spy thriller type of thing, then I think this is sort of fine. But I just wanted different from it. And I saw a lot of opportunities that to me seemed squandered. One is that, historically speaking, this is not an accurate movie. It is a movie that relies heavily on substantial and rather long-winded action sequences with a lot of bullets, a lot of guns, a lot of bombs, a lot of pyrotechnics, etc., etc. And while especially in this current climate, it's very satisfying to see a lot of Nazis get shot. It is not accurate to the actual events that went on in the actual operation historically. There are plenty of other declassified events from that period with the Special Operations Executive and other similar groups that if you wanted to choose a more historically accurate situation to portray, you could have gone that direction if you really cared about that. But I think that's probably a very small nitpick for a lot of people. But the reason that bothers me more is not just the fact that I think it's historically inaccurate, or that it is historically inaccurate. It's that I think it misses a huge opportunity to play to Ritchie's strengths. And especially having just watched The Gentleman yesterday and then watching this movie today, it does put in, again, rather stark contrast some of his skills that are going underutilized. I had already previously raised concerns about The Gentleman and how I thought it was more Hollywoodized and gotten away from the kind of strong character building that Ritchie's writing and directing is typically very good at. Ritchie writes in-depth characters with a lot of reliance on the acting chops of the actors who are cast in order to characterize them in strong terms. And usually over the course of one of Ritchie's films, you get a lot of sort of exploration of the characters' motivations, their flaws, and the way they operate in whatever it is they do. The Gentleman did not do that quite as well as some of Ritchie's earlier works, but this does it even worse. And what's most disappointing is that it starts to do it near the beginning of the film. It sets up with some fairly heavy-handed exposition that was initially I would forgive normally. It starts to set up like this cast of characters, this misfit band who have been gathered to do these special operations that are kind of very unusual, especially for the time. And the cast of characters is initially very compelling. The casting itself is done very well. I actually think that all of the individuals who are cast for these various roles are all very well cast and good actors, and they perform their parts very well. But unfortunately, the characters on screen spend so much time doing things, mostly in action scenes, rather than having more meaningful character growth interaction type of stuff, or even showing how their acts are motivated by their internal motivations, that it felt extra disappointing to me, knowing this was Guy Ritchie, to have those opportunities squandered. This is a fun cast of characters. The dichotomy between each individual, that they're all very distinctive, from right off the bat, is an opportunity squandered. They get very little characterization past maybe the first 20 minutes. They don't even have that much banter between each other. They have a set character and they continue to play to what the character was set up to be, but they never really have exploration. Even the character who probably has the most total arc of character development, whose name I've forgotten, Marjorie Stewart, I believe. She probably has the most overall development, but it never really catalyzes into anything meaningful. It just sort of happens. Things mostly happen to her, and though she's definitely given a decent amount of agency in the narrative, like, she herself doesn't develop into a more full-fledged character through those trials and tribulations. And it's even less so from most of the rest of the cast, because most of the rest of the cast are even more just simply involved in the long action sequences that themselves are not that compelling. By the end of the film, I was already like, by 2/3 of the way, I'm already thinking, okay, we're not getting a lot of character development. I don't even know if we're going to get meaningful showdowns between like these various parties that are being placed in front of us. And the last really big action scene, even though it's built up in ways that seem like they should be compelling, like there's all this setup for it, all these little things that the various characters are doing, the sort of spy type of stuff, which seems to be setting up for a lot. It ends in this long, boring action scene, which is just bad. I don't know how else to say it. It's incredibly long. It doesn't have meaningful like ups and downs in it. It's mostly just a lot of acceleration towards more and more ammunition being fired at one point or another. It's hard to even tell. Sometimes, even though they've like done a lot of setup for it, it's hard to even tell what's happening sometimes, who's where on what location, what exactly their objective is at the moment in time. And even some of the cinematography, which is usually one of Ritchie's strong suits, really fails to frame things in a way that helps us understand all of the moving parts that are present. This is the climactic battle. It should be the moment where we have the most clarity, where we get to see all of the parts come together. And we don't get that. All it is a lot of shaky cam combat footage where it's hard to tell what the stakes really are. It's hard to tell who's where or how much success they're even actually having at their stated intended actions. And I'm already bored of the characters because they're not having any development. It's hard for me at that point as well to even be particularly concerned for their well-being, because up to that point there are multiple occasions where there seems to be fairly low stakes to very serious events that happen, where the narrative tells us there's a threat and even exacts on that threat, but then the next scene it didn't matter, or somebody shrugs it off or whatever. And that could play for humor, but this movie also fails in setting a good tone. The tone is another thing that Ritchie usually has in spades. And while I previously mentioned how this movie does have a levity to it and a humor to it, it's missing heart to it. This was something I was already, again, I didn't like about The Gentleman, because I thought it lacked some of the usual like flourishes and panache and style, in favor of being more digestible by a typical Hollywood action film audience. This goes even further into that place of losing the character, losing the humor, losing the style, and going for instead just flash. One of the things that I hadn't truly appreciated about The Gentleman that I think in retrospect, rewatching it, was better, was that actually it's very restrained in its violence. Ritchie movies, that's like, go watch my video on The Gentleman if you haven't already, because I'm going to reference some of my points here. That movie is very restrained in its violence, and while Ritchie's movies typically hinge very heavily on either acts of violence or threats of violence, they tend to be very restrained in how and when they do the things they do. If there is something that's going to happen, it does it in a very exacting way. And with one or two exceptions in The Gentleman does actually do that still pretty well. This movie loses that almost entirely as well, where between poor cinematography, poor choreography, fight choreography, and just a lack of good tone to go with it, this just becomes one large stage full of violence whenever it does it. It is stylish in the sense of like, the guys are cool and they've got silenced weapons and their power level way exceeds the guys that they're eliminating. And for that, they're kind of, in our cultural viewpoint, they're the cool guys. They're the cool special operations spy type guys. But that's as far as it goes. It would be fine if they did that occasionally and just relished in the violence, but that's the whole thing. There are like basically no moments in the film of just somebody quietly doing exactly what they needed to do without flourishes, without style, but the impact would be heavier because they didn't have to go crazy with it. And that's where I feel like this is the Hollywood kind of stuff seeping further in and undermining Ritchie's style. I don't know. Maybe this is just the evolution he's going on naturally. Maybe this is serious interference from studios, or who knows what else. But to me, it's a disappointing opportunity, especially in a movie that's about special operations. It's not supposed to be, and people who would then be, either directly or indirectly related to the spy genre that comes out of Bond. This should be the opportunity for a narrative about the cool, calm, collected, exacting, no disturbances kind of work. So even if you wanted to make a bunch of concessions from the reality of history and say like, oh, they killed a bunch of people here, even though that didn't actually happen, they could be doing it in a way that is much more richy, much more interesting and compelling, and much less just big firefight, which just bores me. That doesn't mean this is a bad movie, though, like I already said. It's still a pretty good looking movie. It does have a bit of the sort of, I don't know if I've talked about this before. It's got a certain visual post-processing style to it where we've gone away from the desaturated grays and browns colors to, and somebody who is more technical knowledge in the field could say this better than me, but basically there are a lot of things that are hyper saturated, but they've been sort of muddied down. So it's a very colorful look, but without feeling like hyper vibrant to the point of being out of tone. I think it's a better choice than the gray and browns of the 2010s, but it's still, it's not the most visually appealing style. There is some good lighting work here and there. There's also some very bad lighting work here and there. Some of the scenes that happen in darkness are particularly bad. Some of the scenes that happen in darkness are also particularly good. So it's really a mixed bag on that front. The music actually well, the music actually stands out both as sometimes being very, very good. A lot of it has a sort of jazzy, upbeat styling to it that I quite like. But then there are other tracks that are just weird. They sound unfinished or not quite mastered correctly. They can be a little bit jarring in the mix, and just... they just don't, some of them don't sound like they were finished. They don't even necessarily sound like they have the final instrumentation, like there was a placeholder instrument and something else should have been swapped in. It's just weird. But some of the music is very good, and I think it's more good than bad. As I already mentioned, I think the acting across the board is pretty solid. This is a pretty solid cast with some notable actors who you're probably familiar with, especially Cavill and Richardson. But the rest of the cast, actually, Carrie Ells, I don't remember how to pronounce his name. I was trying to place his face because I'm like looking at him throughout the movie going, I know this guy, but I can't place him. But he's from The Princess Bride and Robin Hood Men in Tights, and I haven't seen him in anything in a long time. I didn't actually know he was still an active actor in any regard, so just kind of interesting to see him. He also looks shockingly young for, I don't know, he's not like an old man, but he still looks quite young and would have passed for younger than he actually is. So yeah, good acting pretty much across the board, with again the concessions of having a script that is less than optimal and sometimes just kind of boring, doesn't take the opportunities to do certain things. Also, just as another side note, as with many historical characters, there is often a temptation for somebody like Churchill to be played by somebody who is just trying to do an imitation or even a caricature of Churchill. And I'm very happy to say that the minor the minor position of Churchill in the movie is played by a very good actor who's I'm not familiar with, but does a version of Churchill that's clearly not just trying to ape the real world person. So appreciated on that front. Side note there. But the rest of the, I mean, I think all the acting is totally solid. As far as anything else in particular, the sound mixing could be better here and there. Like I already said, the music is a little bit up and down sometimes. And then again, it falls into, especially with these big bombastic fight scenes, that can be it can, the stuff can get lost in the mix, unfortunately, and it can get a little bit ahead of itself in the sound mixing, in the sound effects work, but it's not egregious. As far as anything else, yeah, I don't have a lot to particularly pick at. I think this is, like I said, a perfectly serviceable action movie for the era, but it disappoints me in a lot of ways because I just know that a lot of people present are capable of better, and I was hoping for more style, more cinematic style. Anyway, I think that's about the gist of my thoughts. Thank you for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.